When most people think of the fall of Rome, they picture an unstoppable juggernaut of barbarians at the gates. Rome's been sacked, Rome is on fire, the Goths are coming, the Visigoths are coming, Alaric is coming, and we're all gonna die. It's certainly a dramatic image, but it's not entirely accurate. Rome didn't collapse in a single catastrophic moment, but rather over a long period of gradual decline. And while it's true that outside invaders played a big part in that process, internal problems may have been just as important. So what really caused the fall of Rome? To answer that question, we're going to need to look at two different moments in time, 476 AD and 1453 AD. Because when people talk about the fall of Rome, they could be talking about either one or both, depending on what part of Rome they're talking about. The Western Roman Empire ended in 476 when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. But by that point, Rome had already ceased to be the dominant power in the Mediterranean. That title belonged to the Eastern Roman Empire, which survived for another 1,000 years until 1453, when it fell to the Ottoman Turks. But before we get into what happened in those 2 years, let's rewind even further back to 27 BC when Octavian, later known as Augustus, became the first emperor of Rome. Ancient Rome had been a republic ruled by an elected senate with the power to make laws and declare war. But Augustus was the first of 28 emperors who would rule the Roman Empire over the next 450 years. Most of them weren't kings. They were technically still considered to be the first citizen or princeps of Rome. And they held power as the supreme executive authority in the empire, though some of them, like Caligula and Nero, wielded more power than others. Under the early emperors, Rome grew to become the largest, richest, and most powerful city in the ancient world. At its greatest extent, the empire covered nearly 2.5 million square miles, stretching from Britain in the north to Egypt in the south, and from Spain in the west to Mesopotamia in the east. Augustus was also the first ruler of the entire Mediterranean region, but he wasn't the king of all the Mediterranean. He shared the title of most powerful person in the region with Cleopatra, the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt. And one thing you should know about ancient kingdoms is that they usually pass down the throne to family members after the king or queen died. So Cleopatra's son Caesarion, born from her relationship with Julius Caesar, inherited the Egyptian throne after her death. But when Caesarion was killed at the Battle of Actium in 32 BC, Augustus was able to take full control of the Eastern Mediterranean, including Egypt, making him the sole ruler of the entire Mediterranean. So where does the Eastern Roman Empire come into this? Well, as the centuries passed, the rulers of Rome started to identify themselves less as the heirs of Augustus and more as the heirs of Constantine, who moved the capital of the empire to the city of Byzantium in 330. The new capital was situated on the eastern edge of the empire and became known as Constantinople. So the official name of the empire changed from Roman to Byzantine. But people today often use the name Eastern Roman Empire because the Byzantines themselves never used the name Byzantine. That term was coined much later by medieval historians who were writing from a distinctly Western European perspective. Anyway, thanks to its strategic location on the Bosporus Strait, Constantinople controlled access between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, making it the empire's main hub for trade and travel. To the west of Constantinople was the old Roman capital of Rome, which was now nothing more than a provincial city in Italy. But Rome remained the spiritual heartland of the empire. In many ways, the story of the fall of Rome is the story of the fall of Constantinople. By the mid-1300s, the Ottoman Turks had expanded their own kingdom from Anatolia into the Balkans and were laying siege to the city. On May 29, 1453, Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II entered Constantinople triumphantly and claimed the title of the Sultan of Rome. Over the next century, the Ottomans would conquer the rest of the Balkans, as well as large parts of North Africa, Western Asia, and even Hungary. But that's not what we're here to talk about. By the time the Ottomans captured Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire was largely devoid of any power and influence. If it had fallen a few decades earlier, we might have said that the empire fell due to external forces. But by the 1450s, the empire's territory only included the Peloponnese, some Aegean islands, and the coastal city of Rhodes. Furthermore, the population of the empire had dropped from 20 to 30 million in the 5th century to around 3 million by the 15th century. So why did the Eastern Roman Empire collapse so gradually and so completely? Let's go back to the sack of Rome in 410. In the late 4th century, Rome was hit by a series of devastating plagues that killed off an estimated 5,000 citizens per day. Historians believe that the plague originated in Egypt and spread throughout the empire via infected rats traveling on ships. Over half the population of the empire died, and the economy collapsed. Adding insult to injury, in 410, a Germanic tribe called the Visigoths sacked the city of Rome. They had been migrating from Scandinavia to the Balkans for several generations, but the Roman authorities blocked their path into the empire and forced them to live in squalid camps along the Danube River. Eventually, the Goths revolted and defeated the Romans in battle. They then marched on Rome and sacked the city. But despite the fact that Visigothic King Alaric famously carried away 800 pounds of gold from Rome's treasury, he wasn't motivated primarily by greed. Instead, his goal was to force the Romans to grant the Goths land within the empire to settle on. And this desire for land would become a recurring theme in the final centuries of the Western Roman Empire. As the centuries passed, more and more Germanic tribes descended into the Roman sphere, including the Vandals, the Burgundians, the Lombards, the Franks and the Angles, Saxons and Jutes, who would go on to conquer England. Many of these groups settled peacefully on land granted to them by Roman officials in exchange for military service. But others demanded independence from Roman rule altogether. Some of these demands were met with violence, such as the Gothic Wars of the 370s and 530s, in which the Visigoths were defeated and forced out of the empire. But other rebellions were put down quickly and easily. And by the 460s, a coalition of Germanic peoples had formed along the Rhine River, threatening to invade Roman territory. A series of corrupt and ineffective emperors preceded Romulus Augustulus, including the notorious Emperor Majorian, who spent more time fighting in taverns than he did in the palace. None of them were prepared for the crisis that was unfolding in the West, and no one was willing to pay the price necessary to stop the barbarian threat. In 476, that price was paid by Romulus Augustulus. When the Germanic chief Odoacer invaded Italy, the emperor was forced to flee to Dalmatia and hire an army to protect him. But the troops he hired were also made up of Germanic mercenaries. After defeating the Roman army in battle, Odoacer marched on Ravenna, where the young emperor Romulus Augustulus was staying. He was given the choice of joining him or being killed. Seeing the writing on the wall, Romulus handed over the imperial regalia, received a noble title, and retired to a villa near Naples, where he lived the life of a rich landowner until his death. Unlike the fall of Constantinople, the fall of Rome was swift and relatively bloodless. And if you've been paying attention, you'll have noticed that I haven't mentioned barbarian invaders sacking Rome in the middle of the 5th century. But there are no records of any such event. Even Alaric, whose name has become synonymous with the sack of Rome, died in 410 without ever having laid siege to the city. Odoacer's deposition of Romulus Augustulus marked the end of the Western Roman Empire, but it had little effect on the Eastern Roman Empire, which would survive for another 1,000 years. So what caused the decline of the West, but not the East? We can point to several contributing factors. The first is the sheer size of the empire. As Rome grew in wealth and power, it expanded into new territories and incorporated new peoples into its domain. Eventually, the empire stretched from Britain to North Africa. This expansion came with administrative challenges. Although the empire reached its greatest territorial extent under Marcus Aurelius, historians argue that the real height of the empire came under Diocletian, who restructured the empire and implemented policies designed to stabilize the economy and improve efficiency. Another contributing factor was the strength of the Western Roman army. The Western Roman army relied heavily on barbarian mercenaries, whereas the Eastern Roman army was made up mostly of Roman citizens. And as we saw, those citizens were becoming fewer and fewer in the face of deadly plagues and a crumbling economy. But perhaps the most important contributing factor was the weakness of Roman leadership. Emperor after emperor proved to be incompetent, corrupt, or ineffective, which contributed to the slow decline of the empire. What do you think? Do you have any other theories about the fall of Rome? Let us know in the comments, and thank you for watching.